Welcome, folks. We'll get going in a minute. Getting a good group. I think we can probably go ahead and get started. So thank you to Americans for a Clean Energy Grid for hosting this webinar. I'm Rob Gramlich, President of Grid Strategies. We do power market and transmission work around the U.S. and general U.S. power sector analysis and consulting. And we have a great set of panelists here. The structure will be, I'm supposed to go through a recent report we did on power demand forecast, which is, of course, the main driver of grid needs these days. So we're going to get a little bit of grounding in what's happening nationally and in different regions with that. And then I was also asked to moderate the session afterwards. And so I'll do that, and I'll do a number of questions with our excellent set of panelists. So why don't I introduce them? You see, of course, the materials in the invitation you got here, but we have Commissioner Kelsey Baggett from the Virginia Corporation Commissioner, Ray Fakori, Energy Policy Manager with Amazon, which is, of course, one of the hyperscalers building a lot of data centers and looking to connect to the grid, and Sarah Freeman, our friend from now Regulatory Assistance Project principal there and former Indiana commissioner for many years, very active in both Midwest as well as national conversations about transmission policy and FERC 1920 and all of that. So really good group, and I sort of would love to just dive in and engage you, but I'm going to follow orders, and I'm going to give a little presentation here. I hate to listen to myself, but you might want to see some of this information. So let's talk about what is happening with power demand, and then we'll get into how are we going to meet it. We'll go around with our panelists and talk about how the heck we're all going to meet all of this power demand and keep rates affordable and service reliable for everybody. So diving in, this is from a report Grid Strategies put out a few weeks ago, which we're now doing every year. 2 years ago, the report was called The Era of Flat Power Demand is Over, and it's really based on the FERC 714 form, a particular utility reporting system that at least my team at Grid Strategies is very familiar with. John Wilson, who has been sort of the lead on this project the last few years, has always used this form, and we know it. It's a little bit of a difficult one to use, but John knows how to do it. So we've been collecting and aggregating all that utility information. And of course, 2.5 years ago, we were all starting to hear rumblings about an uptick in power demand. And sure enough, at that point, the forms really laid out quite a kink in the curve and a big uptick. So we reported on that. And then this is the third time, and the headline is that for the third time in a row, the forecast has risen pretty significantly. You can see the 2025 number here up to 166 gigawatts for the next 5 years. So that's way up from 2022's number of 24. So there's a couple of key facts there. Number one is the sort of the surprise factor that this industry likes to plan things well ahead of time, and the surprise, I think, caught a lot of planners off guard. But also, of course, the magnitude is significant. And then I'm going to talk about some characteristics and aspects of the demand in terms of sort of the shape and the geography in the upcoming slides. And then putting this into perspective, now we're talking about over 5% annual growth, which is pretty extraordinary. Now, it's not by historical standards a growth rate that is unprecedented. It is probably a growth level in terms of gigawatts. It's unprecedented because, of course, over 5% off of today's base is a much bigger base than in the 50s and 60s. But we were dealing with a lot of growth back in those days. So, in some ways, we've been able to meet the pace of growth in the past. But of course, we've, in a way, as an industry and a regulatory community, lost our muscle memory on a lot of these things. It's just not something that most of us in our careers have had to deal with. One interesting finding in this report that we hadn't seen before, and I'm not aware that anybody else has reported on this, but the energy use, which is distinct from the peak demand number, is even higher. Energy growing faster than peak, in other words, and that's that has a lot of implications for the types of energy and types of resources one uses to address it. But you can see in the graph the peak, it kind of goes down the middle, but the energy use is 50% higher up there on the left. So that's just interesting. What it means is that the load factor is higher than the existing average load factor, the load factor of the new resources connecting, and a lot of that is data centers. Now, I should say about all of this is, again, utility forecasts to FERC. This is not necessarily Rob or Grid Strategy saying this is what we know or believe, but it is, real submitted information by utilities. So it is very interesting to see what they are reporting to their regulator. Where's this playing out regionally? We have to start with ERCOT and Texas. It's the biggest source of growth. Probably a lot of reasons for that. Relatively easy to build, economic development friendly, able to build infrastructure, pretty open market, pretty easy to interconnect both load and generation. But for whatever reason, they are leading the way in Texas, which is, of course, famously an isolated grid. Second is PJM, and you can see it wasn't an accident where we put the little dot there. I mean, Data Center Alley, of course, is the start of the big data center concentration or cluster there, and that continues to be a significant area. But it's not just Northern Virginia. There's a lot in Ohio and Pennsylvania and other places now in the whole PJM region, and of course, that region has a number of other challenges trying to meet this demand. A little bit harder to build both generation and load in that area compared to, say, Texas, and certainly harder to build transmission. But PJM is kind of number two. And then SPP, not a lot of people maybe would have picked that, but SPP has the third most. There's a lot up in sort of the Dakotas, and then down in their Texas part near quite a bit of oil and gas development, but also they have their share of data centers in that region and manufacturing. So that's where we are geographically. Of course, data centers get all the headlines and attention, and it's not just data centers. A lot of industrial manufacturing growth is happening. That's been as we all know, a concerted effort by both political parties to bring more manufacturing back to the country. And guess what? It's working. And in fact, in some tech-related industries like chip manufacturing are quite electricity intensive. And so there is quite a lot of power demand from that. And then, of course, electrification of our automobiles and some of our heating and other things. And as I mentioned, oil and gas drilling, other somewhat surprising sectors are electrifying. Electricity is just so darn efficient that a lot of energy uses are shifting over to electricity, so that's also another source. But that said, a majority, about 55%, is the data center boom that we have, so it's really the convergence of the factors. We probably wouldn't have nearly so many challenges if all three of these things weren't happening at the same time, but they do seem to be happening. Now, there's a lot of talk and questions, legitimate questions about are these forecasts real? How much is really behind it? Do you actually know that it's coming? Somewhat similar to what we have on the generation side. There are always way more proposed projects than there are actual projects that go forward, and that's not, I never liked the term speculative about generation. I don't really like it about load either. It's just how the business works. You have to, if you're building anything, you have to, not put all your eggs in one site basket. You have to pursue many sites and then ultimately find out which one to pull the trigger on and move forward with. So that's how the business works on the load side as well as generation. And everybody's trying to sort out how much is real. Each state, at least in these hotspot areas, is introducing new tariffs and approaches to try to get more commitments and solid information. I don't know if our panelists want to talk about that, but it's very relevant to the forecasting question. So we did, as Grid Strategies, look at a number of other sources. Some are looking more at like what's total chip demand and how much electricity do the chips use, and a little bit more of a ground up type of analysis, as well as others, counting up more verified data centers as a source, as opposed to just what the utilities report on their load side. And when you do that, we sort of seem to see a set of estimates converging around the 65 gigawatts level as opposed to the 90 gigawatt level for data centers. Still a lot, really, by any measure. And when you compare to the other demand sources, whether the total is 140 versus 166, that's still a lot. And, arguably that error is noise, and we still need to plan for something in that range. But anyway, just to identify, it is an ongoing question, and utility forecasts, there are reasons to think maybe they aren't 100% accurate. Another new thing is the rise of gigawatt scale data centers. We have proposed ones that are proposed to operate in 2026, shown in the yellow dots, and some in 2027, shown in the blue dots, the size of the dot indicating the facilities. But there are a number that are, it used to be 50 megawatts was big, then into the low hundreds, then the high hundreds, and now we're a gigawatt or above for some of these facilities, which is a lot. This is more some of this is multiple data centers in an area, not just single data centers, but there are some very big ones. And the gigawatt scale data centers accounted for around half of the new data center power demand, indicating that this really is kind of a major trend in the industry to have bigger and bigger. There are obvious economies of scale involved in doing it all in one place. We're going to talk about, well, I'll get into in another slide about some of the physical aspects of that and co-location. It's really interesting to kind of compare the fiber network, this NREL slide. NREL is no more, and now it's the National Lab of the Rockies, but whatever you call it, it's got this cool indication of the power network overlaid with the broadband network, and you can kind of see some of the data centers also indicated by circles here on this map in terms of where the concentration is. And of course, you can see Data Center Alley there in Virginia, and then a bubble emerging in Columbus or Ohio neighborhood, and then some in Texas and some of the Southwest. So it just gives you another indication. Ideally, the data centers like to be both the fiber and the power. And in some places, those things are both present. So one thing, certainly a critical question for the industry and regulators, FERC and states, is how are we going to meet all this demand, and what's the role of transmission in that? And so a couple slides on transmission before I wrap up here. First of all, we on the left side, you can see we built quite a lot, around 4,000 megawatts of very high voltage transmission lines over 345 kV back like 2013. So 12, 13 years ago, we had a moment of building it. And then for whatever reason, it kind of went down to a trickle down in 2022, almost none, a little uptick in 2023 and 2024. So kind of starting to get back when I think everybody's realizing how congested and constrained the grid, and some plans have come together. That's the optimistic way to look at it. The half-empty way to look at it is some of those lines in 2024 were the ones started in the aughts, 15, 20 years ago, and they just finally got done. So it probably says more about recent federal permitting approvals of lines that were sitting around for years than it does about necessarily showing that we're actually fixing the problem finally. And even though spending is up, and of course this is also the number of challenges related to affordability these days, but spending on transmission has been up, but it's not the kind that has increased the capacity. It's really just replacing damaged lines or making them more resilient, or just replacing 50, 60, 70-year-old assets that needed replacement regardless. Interregional transmission comes in as well as regional. And one of the big stories there for resource adequacy purposes, there's many different maps and charts you could show on this, but generally when one area is peaking, the other neighboring area is not, which means there's a lot of opportunity to share, and yet usually the regions don't fully take advantage of that diversity. But interregional transmission can tap into that diversity. And then, of course, we should do what's cheapest, easiest, and quickest first. So advanced transmission technologies come in here: dynamic line ratings, topology optimization, advanced power flow control, high performance conductors are some of the advanced transmission technologies that could unlock quite a lot of gigawatts. These are DOE numbers on ATTs that could come in. So I think a lot of states, at least over 15, I think, had legislation related to these. So I think there's a lot of interest in exploring these opportunities. And then we like to say, in case people don't, or get too sort of defeatist about the challenges of transmission, again, 12 years ago, we did build a lot, either some of the lines, the MISO MVPs, SPP priority projects, ERCOT CREZ, California ISO. Those are some of the lines we built, and it seemed to be a pretty consistent formula. First, having a regional tariff, actually having an ISO or RTO, which could plan it and then put the costs into the tariff. However they share the costs, whether it's more broadly or more concentrated to certain users. The fact is there is a mechanism to do it and recover the cost. And so that formula seems to work pretty well. That's why we always talk about the 3 Ps: planning, permitting, and paying to get transmission built. And there are certainly policies that are either midstream, like FERC Order 1920, or being discussed in Congress, like with the permitting reform and Energy Permitting Reform Act, EPRA bill, that get involved with the planning, permitting, and paying. Here are some of the recent activities or discussions around those. I think I'll probably, I want to stop talking and get to our panelists here, so I'll just have you glance at that for a minute. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and really turn it to our panel. That's been a fair amount of information there. If you guys want to come back on screen so we can have a little conversation about these challenges. Judge Baggett, I will start with you if you're up for it. Virginia certainly is having a lot of questions, and we do not want to get into anything contested or anything like that, and none of us will. At least we'll try not to go there. You can tell us if we do it, but the question here is not about anything super specific. It's really just more broadly. And I know you're very active in NARUC, and I know you were very active at FERC and in the regional state dialogues there, or FERC state dialogue. Your general thoughts on how, as a nation and set of regions, we can address some of this power demand and some of the infrastructure needs.
Sure. Just keeping it sort of broad, it seems to me, just given the change in landscape in the last 5-10 years or so, but particularly now when we're seeing the load growth that we are seeing and projecting into the future, we're certainly going to have to build a lot of generation, right? Which necessarily includes the transmission component. And our system has typically been, for at least in my mind, how I think about it, transmission planning it seems like it's been reactive. We look at where the generators are coming and we try to build the best way around it, right? And I think that if we want to build quickly and efficiently and also with an eye to affordability, we need to start being proactive in the way that we plan transmission. And 1920 does a little bit of that. It sort of starts to step us in the right direction. But I think there are still synergies between the generation side and the transmission side that need to be looked at. I think the other challenge, putting my state regulator hat on, with proactive planning, and maybe why we haven't gotten there as quickly as I think we need to, is the who pays question, right? Which is what mires most of these projects in litigation at the state level. It's what, everyday consumers are concerned about. And so in order to be comfortable proactively building, I think we need to pay attention to cost allocation. And at the state level, that means making sure that we are allocating transmission build to the folks that are, driving the need for the build, right? And that will get the end use consumer customer more comfortable with the amount of transmission that we're building, and I think ultimately the rate regulators. So that's a high level answer. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's sort of how I'd start it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. We'll dive into some of that a little bit more in a minute. But Sarah, why don't I go to you? RAP advises many states, and you do that now. And of course, you were deep into some of these transmission conversations over the last 3 to 5 years. Your thoughts on this power demand dynamic and infrastructure?
Yeah, it's massive, right? And it's certainly fascinating as I've shifted my focus from something very Indiana specific, where we've navigated the challenges in our own way through the IURC, the Indiana Commission, to taking more of a regional and national focus now that I'm at RAP. Given that this is a transmission focused webinar, and that's where your presentation ended up, I talk a little bit about how important transmission is in this type of build out. But I really want to lean in on Judge Baggett's point of becoming more proactive and perhaps using both the FERC, the state commissions, and other organizations. And I'll plug RAP and all of our other NGO friends in here as well, in their convener roles, because the conversations are so big and the costs are so incredibly high. And we love to throw around how, Ray and his counterparts at the other large load customers have, endless money to spend on things. But that's not what this is about, right? This is making optimal choices and looking at things holistically. I'm also super interested and tried to emphasize this in my work as a commissioner in Indiana, and definitely am doing so at RAP, looking at ways to delay the transmission build out by focusing on tools that we have in play already, right? So I'm looking at our existing technologies, ATTs, DERs, virtual power plants, anything like that. And Judge Baggett, I know you've done a lot of work with that, requiring things to be included, like in Dominion's IRPs. And thank you, because it's so critical that we force our utilities to take these bigger picture looks. So those are just some of my general thoughts. And then I guess it all takes time, but the more we can talk, and if we talk early and often, the better off we're all going to be. I'll kind of leave it at that for now and address anything in follow-ups if you have them.
Good. No, perfect. Thank you for that. Ray, you know a little bit about power demand and infrastructure. You're on the front lines all over the country on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks, Robin. Appreciate the comments that are being made. I think what we're seeing is that energy growth, demand growth is economic growth. And it's really driving it's not only just growing in the data center space, but as was mentioned, we're electrifying everything. And it's a conscious choice as a country that we've made to onshore manufacturing, to electrify fleets, to ensure that we're kind of pushing towards an electrified future. And so from our standpoint, I think ultimately we want to help be a solution to a lot of these challenges that we're facing and really think about them from an opportunity standpoint, right? What can we be doing to help enable more carbon-free energy resources to come onto the grid, right? And in order to do that, it is critical to have access to transmission. I think you really can't talk about deploying more supply to meet load growth without talking about transmission. But you mentioned, I mean, a lot of the transmission lines that are out there that are being built have been in the planning stages for decades. And I know just from personal experience, you know, the project that I was working on before joining AWS, I think, you know, is about to be able to buy its first drink. It's been in the permitting process for nearly 20 years. And I think that's just something that we really need to get a better handle on as a country, is be able to build these transmission lines to have the most impact for a majority of customers and to make sure that we're benefiting all those that are paying for it. But ultimately, to your point, there are things that we can and should be doing in the short term to ensure we're maximizing the grid we already have, right? Deploying a reconductoring with high performance conductors, ensuring that we have dynamic line rating, increases and improvements on the technology side, and really just all tech on deck so that we can ensure that we're making the most out of what we have now.
That's great. Thanks for that. Some areas, Ray, I'll stick with you for a second. I don't know if you have thoughts on sort of like power market development as well. That doesn't get as much attention. We sort of reached a détente. Some areas have RTOs and open markets, others don't. Any comments on that? It always struck me. I'll just say my own, you know, thought is just looking as a, you know, I mean, I got into this doing like linear programming and dispatch optimization from way back, and like some regions don't even share dispatch across areas, but they're looking at markets now. Any thoughts on that in terms of squeezing more efficiencies out of the grid?
I mean, certainly there's a lot that we can do. A lot of this is really focused, and Judge Baggett really hit it with this. It's all reactive, right? We're reacting to where load is now without thinking about how to optimize for future load growth. And so I think a lot of the things that we're using to communicate, whether it be, you know, programs, I think, you know, sending spreadsheets back and forth to do engineering studies, there is a way to integrate artificial intelligence, machine learning, the highest standards of all of these software programming, so that we can identify the optimal spots to build out transmission, ensure that we're running quicker engineering studies so that we know what should get on the grid more quickly and what can't. And more so, better understanding why do network upgrade costs what they do, right? I think we can integrate these new technologies onto the system and ensure that utilities have the latest software, grid programmers and grid operators understand where power is running. And I think being able to integrate these technologies both on the customer side, but also on the utility side, will go a long way. So that's certainly something that has yet to be fully tapped. And I think as we start to utilize more of these technologies, these AI machine learning technologies, we'll be able to have, you know, digital twins of the grid to better understand what impacts look like from a load standpoint, what impacts look like from a generation standpoint, when to deploy battery storage for that matter. So I think there's a lot of really interesting solutions that have yet to be really fully realized. And so I think something to keep in mind as we think about how to compensate folks for making those investments as well.
Yeah, Rob, can I jump in on, I just want to,
Please.
yeah, you know, echo what Ray was saying there about optimizing ways to get better information to a broader group of people as we're looking at transmission planning, because something that I struggle with now at the state commission, right? At FERC, I feel like I lived in the world of the PJM RTEP and interregional projects and projects that are going across multiple states, even if they're within PJM, right? But for example, in Dominion's last IRP, they include as an appendix a list of all of the transmission projects that are planned to come into service within the study period, right? So within a 15-year, 2024 to 2039 period. And during that period, the spreadsheet includes, 200 to 250 projects, just located transmission projects, ranging from about 115 kV to 500 kV, located in Virginia. And then, the reason about 60% are, labeled as driven by data centers or sort of mixed reasons, and then others are not. And that's an incredible amount of transmission projects for one state and one state commission to think about. And so trying to understand, what are the efficiencies in all of those projects, right? Are there regional projects that could, or more efficient, larger projects that could actually address some of these 200 smaller projects? And what does that look like from, a holistic planning process? And what does that look like from a load, meeting load growth? But it's hard to square what's happening at the federal level with this list of 200 projects at the state level. And we just don't have the time or resources to really dig in. So we need help there. And I think that's where technology and innovations can really be a huge boon going forward in terms of getting people comfortable that we're building the most efficiently.
Well, that's really, yeah, please, Sarah. And I was if you could also comment on this sort of build efficiently at the scale, because there are huge economies of scale. And then that gets to the proactive term that the two of you used. So go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Quickly on the technology side, we've already seen both PJM and MISO reap the benefits of using AI in their, interconnection queue as they've reformed those processes, right? They've been able to demonstrate significant reductions in time. So that's an example of leaning into technology. But yeah, Rob, I could. Most of my time in transmission land was my work through the organization of MISO states. But when you look at MISO's long-range transmission planning project, or its earlier work with the multi-value project portfolios, the MVPs, or SPP's coordinated planning that they do, you can really see the benefits of taking that big picture look and, to use Ray's optimization, right? That's what we're getting here. And Judge Baggett, I share that frustration with the piecemeal state project approach. The projects are needed, yes, right? You can demonstrate that there's a reliability need, there's an economic need being served, but could it be better served if we took a hot second and looked at it throughout the region, right? But the length of time, you're so spot on there. The human and capital resources it takes to do that well are seriously intense. But for large load integration, that's going to trigger all kinds of affected system studies, right? And you're going to see upgrades happening in one jurisdiction, or being triggered by one jurisdiction and then being built in an entirely separate jurisdiction, possibly really far away. And where are those costs going to be allocated? Where it's built, but not by the person that caused the cost. And so anything we can do to pull all of it together, synthesize it, and again, be proactive and holistic in our approach. I'm there for all of it.
Well, that's great. And as I said earlier, you both were involved in the federal state, dialogue, which resulted in a few things. I think a greater state role in transmission planning than ever was the case, though not everywhere. I used to do a lot of work with SPP in the early days, and those states always wanted to be very involved, and they were. And that was, I think, part of a model for what other regions could do where the states have not been so evolved. And the reality, despite all the talk about permitting reform and backstop siting, the reality is most transmission is sited at the state level. So the states better be involved and engaged. And they and the communities affected sure do want to know whether alternatives were evaluated. Is this really the necessary place for this line or type of line or things like that? So any comments from any of you about sort of this sort of how do we plan as regions and states together to accomplish all these multiple factors together and get more consensus on what's needed to hopefully, build the right amount and type and place of infrastructure?
Just commenting on PJM, where I think we're seeing a lot of this load growth and we're going to see a lot of need for new transmission, or we already are. It's been interesting working through the 1920 state process, where we're trying to work on that 1920 planning process and what that means for cost allocation. As you mentioned, the states now have a new, more prominent role in that. And to some extent, my state colleagues may not like me saying this, but it's sort of like the dog that caught the car. Now we don't know what to do with it, right? And we are such a diverse group of states in PJM in terms of our geography and our interests and our regulatory structures. And so it has really been a challenge to see how can we all come together and create a framework that we all agree on so that we can move forward with the transmission that we agree is needed transmission, right? And so there's trust that needs to be built. And I think the lack of that relationship that didn't exist before has caused some hurdles with, as Sarah mentioned, maybe one state causing the need for a transmission build in another state and feeling like the allocation isn't appropriate. And so there's a lot of work being done, particularly in the PJM states, to build that trust and see if we can come up with a paradigm that we can all get comfortable on, because otherwise what's happening now, and I think what will continue to happen, is projects get proposed and then fought about and then killed because people don't like them. And so we avoid that by getting buy-in in the front. That takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, but I think on the back end has a lot of gain. So we're working through that now. It's tough, but I think we'll get there. And I think honestly, there's a lot of great things to come out of 1920. I think that relationship building that's having to happen at the state level is one of the most important things that 1920 drove in the PJM region.
That's very helpful. Sarah, thoughts on that based on your years with OMS, which, was more involved than PJM states, I would think is fair to say, in the past.
We're pretty heavily involved. They are pretty heavily involved. I'm still in that transitional phase of we to they right now. So for those of you watching, please excuse any misspoken words on my part. I mean, in the SEAMS work that we engaged in, through MISO with SPP is definitely very different than the SEAMS work that we did with PJM OPSI. And a lot of it is a trust issue. I'm thinking not just about commissioners and commission staff here too, though, right? I'm thinking about CEOs of RTOs and how they engage with each other. That matters a lot. And when they can get in and develop healthy relationships and build that degree of trust, because I think as commissioners, we are heavily invested. You are heavily invested in doing so. And we see the positive outcomes of that across the board, right? So getting that at CEO levels, and I know, Judge Baggett, you're seeing this in PJM all the time now, involvement by the state governors as well. There's a new group playing in the playground now, and pulling everybody together to get educated is hard. And I'd be curious to hear from the Ray's perspective, if it's okay for me to interject that way, Rob, on how large load customers are engaging with all these different audiences as well, because the scope of the conversation is changing significantly.
Totally.
Yeah,
no,
great. Go ahead.
I think it's been rather interesting. I think the struggle from our side, we are seeing it's the who pays question, right? I think from a large load standpoint, we are more than happy to pay for our full cost of service, right? And I think that's really something that you've seen us take more of a direct role in, whether it's engaging in large load tariffs across the country, or in federal filings, which was something that we hadn't had to do prior to this growing energy, paradigm. I think the struggle ultimately is we want to make sure that folks kind of think about this as not particularly the cause of one customer, but really just an investment that we are making because the grid in and of itself has been underinvested in for decades, right? I think a lot of the facilities that have been built were built during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and it's time to kind of continue that upgrading process. And it's not just for, hey, now that the data centers have showed up, it's the data center fault. It really is. We as a country are embracing new technologies like EVs and induction ovens and heat pumps, and we are starting to accelerate the electrification of a number of various technologies that previously hadn't been a part of the conversation, right? So I think when we talk about the need for transmission, it is not just transmission to serve one particular customer type, but really, the idea of excess capacity on the grid for any customer right now is really non-existent, right? Whether you're, trying to integrate a heat pump or you're just trying to have a fleet of EVs for your facilities, because you are deciding to move in that general direction. The struggle is we have to ensure that we're taking a very comprehensive approach to how we invest in this and not saddling one particular customer type with the overinvestment. So I think there's a lot of transparency that needs to be part of the process, transparency in the interconnection study agreements, the engineering studies, and just to better understand why do things cost what they cost, and how do we ensure that we're not just prioritizing or helping to incentivize one particular customer.
So I don't want to, Rob, if you have another question, but
Please.
I just want to react to that without jumping into the full ANOPR discussion, because I don't know that we need to do that here. But I do agree, right? I don't think it's helpful when we think about transmission to say, oh, it's data centers that are driving it, therefore data centers should pay, because there's a lot of finger pointing, and that sort of erodes that trust that each state is trying to build, and each commission and each region and RTO. And it really isn't true that it's 100% data centers, right? I mean, we've always thought of transmission as a grid that benefits everybody, right? And so I think it's dangerous to start parceling it off too much, for one group of customer. So I will say that is my only fear with moving towards a more like federalized system of transmission siting or permitting, or more control over the federal planning for transmission and generation to the extent it gets integrated. Is it does start to feel like when you look at the state commission level, and I look at my state legislators, right? When all of a sudden it's happening in Washington, and we're pretty close to Washington, it feels as if it's being driven by one particular customer interest, right? And not the interest. It gets harder to tell that story, that this is actually potentially beneficial for all customers in lots of different ways. And so I'm worried that if we do that, we sort of win the battle but lose the war, in that you'll start to see state legislatures or governors using whatever levers they do have to be disruptive in other ways, right? Whether it's new moratoriums against data center build out, or changing, zoning requirements, or, requirements for CPCNs in their states. Like, there are always the tools they can do to be disruptive when they feel like their voice isn't heard. And so I think that is a balance that we really need to keep in perspective as we figure out what those reforms look going forward.
Good perspective. I know there was discussion of that at the NARUC meeting, and a lot of states saying be careful with that. There are risks and downsides. I want to steer a little bit back to, I think all three of you had said something about like the new large loads should pay a greater share, and that has some benefit to existing ratepayers. Also has some benefit probably to our load forecast. To if there's more of a commitment, then we know which ones are real. The question is, I guess how to do that in a way that also provides some certainty. One of the challenges we have on the generation side with full participant funding when the customers pay is you end up having multiple engineering firms and law firms debating every nickel of who's responsible for what, when in fact it's just a total function of whether the other guy drops out of the queue or not. And it's like misplaced precision, because you really don't, the engineering is not actually nearly as relevant as just like the commercial effect of who's in or who's out. And one concept that's emerging around a lot is more of an entry fee, or like the SPP CPP approach, which you may not be following that docket at FERC, but like there's a framework of like, yeah, okay, yeah, the customers can pay whatever share, pick your percentage, but it's like defined up front. And we don't then have every, law firm and engineering firm arguing about it. And it's not this like do loop of endless who's in, who's out process, but we can actually get people connected, give them some certainty, set the rate at what it is. Any thoughts on that framework as we start thinking about whether it's the ANOPR or whether it's a state-run process, addressing the issue that way with some certainty, but with some assignment of cost more to the customer?
Yeah, I mean, anything that would work to improve the quality of projects getting into the queue is certainly something that we would consider. I mean, we've seen things on the generation side of the interconnection queue that say you need to have, a certain degree of land control, more money that is at risk when entering into a queue. And I think we certainly, from an AWS perspective, would love to help reduce level of speculation in queues, because we've seen how an overwhelming number of projects into a queue ends up in a moratorium, kind of a de facto moratorium, where the size just becomes overwhelming and you start seeing less approvals, which means less projects connecting to the grid. So I think from our standpoint, we've welcomed kind of various policies while considering, the comprehensive approach to it, of ensuring that we take a non-discriminatory approach to any of these policies, where we aren't saying one customer type needs to pay or do something that would be unlike any other customer type, but that there are some senses of, improved site control, ensuring that there's more money up front to collect during the study phases. And if you're going through study phases and dropping out later on in the study phase, then there's some money that's needs to be put up for collateral, right? In order to be able to have those studies completed in a timely fashion. But on the flip, I think it's also really important to ensure that when we are providing these additional resources and paying more upfront in these large load tariffs and having higher minimums, I think it's also really important to ensure that the timelines are being met on the other side, right? Ensuring that studies are coming back in an orderly fashion, that we're getting projects reviewed and considered in a timely fashion, so that not only are we getting results back quickly, but we're making decisions quickly, so that we aren't in a situation where there's just a never-ending doom loop of study, restudy, and entry and dropout.
Great. Judge Baggett, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think to move to that more proactive sort of build and then allocate resources among those who want to pay for it, you absolutely need to move to a model where there's certainty up front, right? And you're not just creating an endless line. I think that's one of the biggest benefits of moving towards a more like proactive network open season type model, right? Is that you can rationally allocate the capacity, and people know when they sign up for it what they're gonna pay, what it's gonna cost them. And so rather than have queues where people are speculating on what their costs are gonna be, which it has repercussions on the generator side in terms of, one of the problems in PJM is we're just not seeing independent generators respond to the market signals, even though the prices are going higher. But part of that is because when you are trying to finance these projects, there is so much uncertainty about what you're going to pay for, what your network upgrades look like. And so they're all so interrelated that I think if we can come up with a new model that's not just people sitting in a queue and speculating and playing a game of when to drop out and when not, I think it leads to more proactive transmission planning, but also kind of brings the rest of the system along with it.
Yeah, very interesting. And the new numbers for network upgrade costs for the gas generators who are part of RRI, I think were eye-popping for people. And it's a little bit I don't know, gratifying in a bad way. Like it wasn't just wind and solar. It wasn't just my wind and solar friends squawking about this. It's whatever is going to try to connect to the grid is going to face this. And here we are. You know, it's a congested grid. Costs are high if you don't sort of proactively plan and cluster and do all those things. I think we temporarily lost Sarah. I want to make sure I get to a more of a technical question and start with you, Ray. You know, there's this question people say, oh, like, look, a lot of data centers have co-located generation. Don't want to talk about the contested dockets about that, but really more just the physical aspect of, yeah, some, you know, generation is being put either on site or near site, and that's, you know, there's reasons for that. But the question is, does that mean there's less of a need for the grid and grid expansion? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think top of mind is we don't want to create two different systems, right? We don't want two different queues. We want to ensure that we don't have two different markets. And so I think one of the reasons why you're seeing this response to co-location is simply because we aren't moving fast enough. And so it's a speed to market opportunity for us. I think when we are considering how that looks, ultimately for AWS, we would much prefer to be connected to the grid. I think there are some redundancy benefits that come with grid connection. It's also why you see us sort of enabling energy generation and capacity through our PPA agreements, because when we invest in these projects, we think not only do they benefit our own energy investments, but they benefit the grid as a whole. And so we're kind of filling up that pool back up as we're using it. So I think from our standpoint, co-location is a tool in the toolbox, but it certainly isn't this silver bullet that folks are kind of making it out to be. I think a lot of different players are looking to this as a solution, but I think at the end of the day, there's still some policy uncertainty around what the co-location will entirely look like for new, existing, you know, kind of that paradigm. But I think at the end of the day, it's really just a response to slower timelines, really long interconnection queues for load, and really long interconnection queues for generation. So I think top of mind for us, we want to help ensure that we are accelerating the deployment of supply, because it's going to have a greater impact to all customers rather than just to say, we're going to take our ball and we're going to go home and build our own resources and kind of sit this one out. So I think that's why you're seeing us take equity positions in a number of companies that bring about carbon-free energy resources like X Energy with the 5 gigawatt small modular nuclear reactor target by 2039. I think you'll continue seeing us kind of making that push in the renewable space as well. But ultimately, I think being grid connected from our standpoint outweighs being co-located.
That's very helpful. Sarah, welcome back. We saw you had a technical glitch, no problem. We'll shift instead of catching you up on all that.
Okay.
Might get into I think each of you mentioned something about advanced transmission technologies, and there were some questions in the Q&A here about what are the barriers there. I think that's a topic you've thought about some, and you know, FERC and states and utilities have been looking at that. Any thoughts, starting with you, and then if Judge Baggett or Ray want to comment as well?
Yeah, and thanks for not forcing me to jump in at the tail end of a question that I didn't hear. I think I crashed my hotel's Wi-Fi by doing this. I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm back. The blunt answer from my perspective to that question, I'm getting quiet, like somebody can hear me talking who's in like around me, who isn't on this webinar. My blunt response is you just can't make as much money off of those technologies. The utilities can't, right? That there's not an incentive to do that. And when there's not an incentive for them, it's not a priority issue for the RTOs to integrate those types of things into their systems either. I don't think the solution to that is to suddenly start compensating utilities to do something they could already quite easily do. But that's the main barrier, you know, I observed as a state commissioner and continue to see now in my role as RAP, where I'm excited to be able to explore it a little more holistically and possibly provide solutions to my friends around the country.
Good.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a struggle, right? I mean, we have litigated proceedings at the state level. The utility says one thing, has testimony about it. Other folks have another. There's often not, you know, the time or the depth in the record for us to really, we take a little baby steps, right? We kind of inch our way there. We have made progress in terms of requiring our utilities to provide upfront a lot more evidence and testimony about what technologies they did consider. But I think OPSI is also working very hard in PJM through this 1920 process to really put some accountability on the PJM planning process, right? Because I do think when you're looking at opportunities for competitive transmission build out where folks are bidding into these processes, right? I think if PJM actually starts holding people accountable to demonstrate in those processes how they have integrated these advanced technologies, considered them, or how they are part of the solution, and that becomes part of the criteria that they consider when they're picking bidders. I mean, that's the best way to motivate people, right? Through a competitive process and say, hey, this is what we're going to require of you if you're going to, if we're going to pick you as a project, or it's an important criteria to us. And so I think PJM has been lagging in that space compared to some of the other RTOs. Admittedly, I'm not super engaged where the other RTOs are on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if PJM is behind the curve there. So we are really trying to also sort of get some accountability in that competitive transmission planning process as well, because it is an affordability issue, right? I mean, that is a key piece to that affordability question.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
A real
Judge Baggett,
challenge.
you hit the exact point that I really wanted to emphasize, is that it is to prioritize ATTs, to prioritize affordability. I mean, transmission costs, both transmission and distribution costs, are typically the largest portion of customer bills. And while rates are generally, you know, they will do what rates do, I think people are responding to bills. And so ensuring that we've exhausted all cost-effective technology choices first is critical. And I think that's why you've seen us kind of take a really strong position, both at the state and wholesale market level, on ATTs, GETs, whatever you want to call them. I think ultimately it is critical to deploy these resources because we've kind of moved away from them being experimental. They've been utilized across the country, across the globe, and are having resounding impacts. They are not a silver bullet, and you know, no one is claiming as such, but doing more with what we already have is going to go a lot further while we continue to build new transmission, right? We have to do, it's a yes and for sure.
Well,
That's
and
great.
I think
Go ahead.
that's part of, just really quickly, I mean, I think that's part of the struggle, right? Is even if we all believe that these are beneficial from an affordability standpoint and are not, you know, concepts, but are actually like proven technologies that can be beneficial, I don't think any one of us would say, well, that solves everything with the level of load growth we have, right? We have to also build. This isn't in lieu of building, it's in addition to. And so I think when you're thinking through like, okay, well, we're gonna have to build anyway, it's really easy to like if I'm trying to be as kind to PJM as I can, if I'm putting my hat on, they're thinking, well, we have to build these big projects, right? We got to plan and figure out the interregional projects or the 500 kV that go across 4 different states. And so, yes, it would be great if we spend some time optimizing, you know, all these other technologies, but that's sort of not the priority. And I don't know that that's the right way to be thinking about it, because that is, like you said, the affordability piece, right? That is the piece that can help keep rates as low as possible or bills as low as possible as we're going through this transition. And so I think we have to figure out how we incentivize the people that are actually proposing these projects to do the heavy thinking and come forward with them, as opposed to on the back end, you know, with a stick trying to bang them over the head saying, why didn't you do it? Because I don't think that's going to work, just given the limited resources we have.
Yeah.
Especially when a number of these technologies could alleviate the massive network upgrade costs that would be borne by all customers, right? I think at the end of the day, anybody can run engineering studies to tell you where the constraints are, where the congestion is and exists, and then being able to deploy these resources. I mean, to your point, maybe it's a competitive auction that allows for folks to be able to bring these solutions forward and say, hey, who is able to alleviate these constraints, right? We're seeing it across. This isn't just a PJM issue or a MISO issue. It is a national problem. And quickly deploying these resources will have massive impacts.
So we're at time. I think we're going to have to wrap here. Great answers all around. Really appreciate Judge Baggett, Ray Fakori, Sarah Freeman. Thank you for your time, for joining us. Thanks to Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, ACEG, and Christina Hayes and the team there, OVIA for setting this up. And everybody have a great day.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Rob.
Phil. Bye-bye.